So I will present some studies on Sweden. So I will relate some of my research to some of the major dilemmas that I see with the parental leave in Sweden. I want to talk about 3 studies, and they all start in Swedish reports, really. So they are asked for knowledge from the Swedish agencies in some way or another. So in some way, this is research that is demanded for, but I'm not always sure how well it is understood. And I have the sense that we really want to focus on the good outcomes of the somewhat radical policy that is done in Sweden. But of course, I and all of us think that it's really important to be honest and to scrutinize the policies and to see the actual effects that are sometimes in different directions. This is like kicking in open doors for a research community, but I still want to mention it because it's an important point. So I want to talk about 3 studies, one about which fathers in Sweden are not using the parental leave, and then one about newly arrived immigrants and how they used parental leave in Sweden and what that might lead to. And lastly, flat rate for benefit in Sweden that you get if you didn't work before you had a child, that has increased quite a lot recently. And I want to talk about whether that had any effects on work or having more children. So the 3 goal conflicts that I think about in the Swedish parental leave system are the incentive to work and economic security for children with small families. Well, the incentive to work, of course, it's the policy when it was started in the 1970s was to make it possible for especially women to work and become mothers at the same time. So this is a basic that you should continue to work, but while you become a parent. But lately, the economic security for all families have become more and more in the forefront of policy. So it's really a problem of the flat rate, of the difference between income-related benefits and the flat rate. The second goal conflict is that we want parents and families to have a freedom to choose how they care for their children, and also gender equality. And this is a problem of the reserved months and how they are used. And lastly, the flexibility. This has to do with the freedom to choose, but the flexibility in the leave is something we think is important, but it also leads to different labor market outcomes for different groups. In Sweden, we're often fast to jump to call this a housewife trap, but I think it's a goal conflict between having flexibility and also to see that there are different labor market outcomes. So just for those of you who don't think of the Swedish parental leave every day, which is strange to think that there are any ones like that, but still a very short review of the leave. It's 16 months for parents to share, and actually it's 8 months to each parent, but then you can transfer between the parents. You get 80% of your earlier income for the largest part of these 16 months, or if you didn't work for the 8 months leading up to having a child, you get this low flat rate. And that flat rate used to be really low, it used to be €6 a day, but it doubled in 2002. And since that, it has doubled again. So today it's €25 a day. So it's actually kind of substantial. It's coming close to a badly paid part-time job in Sweden. The leave is residence-based, meaning that everyone who lives in Sweden have access to the leave. And it's also flexible in the way that up until 2014, you could use the leave whenever you wanted until the child was 8. So it was very possible to save, say, a week or extend your Christmas holidays with a couple of days that you had saved and so on. So it was very flexible. It's somewhat reduced now, but it's still flexible in how you can use it. There are 3 reserved months. Sometimes these are called daddy months. We don't want to do that in the gender-neutral country of Sweden. But these reserved months, they only there for the ones that are using it income-related. If you're using the low flat rate, that is, if you're outside of the labor market, one of the parents, and then typically the mother, can use the whole leave, which is brought up as a problem today. This is something that you find if you look at the Swedish official statistics. It's the increase of father's share, and it's up to 1/3 of all the leave today. And this is something often shown. So fathers use 1/3 of all the leave. Another thing that's often shown is how many parents or what share of parents are using the parental leave more or less gender equally, saying that they are sharing it somewhere between 40 and 60%. And that has doubled since 2005. So it was about 1/10 of all parents, and today it's almost 1/5 of all parents are using the leave more or less equally. But the second figure I'm showing here is this then divided by education. And the first is the ones with basic education, the middle bar is the ones with secondary, and the last bar are the ones that have tertiary education. And you can see that there's a very strong difference between. So it's actually the highly educated fathers and mothers that are sharing the leave. This is shown if you look at Swedish official statistics, but we don't know anything in the official statistics about who is not using the leave, neither for fathers or mothers. So these numbers are completely unupdated, I would say. The official statistics that we have from that is from 2009 or so on. So therefore, I'm part of a project where we are looking at this, which fathers in Sweden are actually not using the leave. And this is work I'm doing together with a colleague at the Inspectorate for the Social Insurance, Susanne Fahlén. And what we do in this study is that we use the register data. We look at all children born in Sweden from 1994 up to 2017. We follow the parents for 2 years after they are born, children are born. We exclude some, but very few actually. About 2% of all these children are excluded because they are either the children or the parents are migrating, and someone is deceased, or you're not the custodian living with the parents. It's very common not to be a custodian from the beginning. You're only a custodian from the beginning if you are married in Sweden. So you need to register. It's very common to not be it and to register later. But if you're a non-custodian and you're not living with your child, then you don't have the same rights to parental leave. So those are also excluded. And we divide up, we're looking at 3 outcomes. We compare 3 outcomes. The reference group, or the group that's supposedly the normal way of doing it, is to use more than 1 month of leave. And then we compare that to the fathers that are not using any days for the first 2 years, and then the fathers that are using very little. We're thinking that if you're using only, less than 1 month, that is not always, but commonly you're taking extra days for Christmas holidays, or maybe a week extra for the summer, or so on. So it's very rarely such short leaves are really indicating that you have sole custody of your child for a longer period. So we think that this group is more related to the ones not using any leave. So what do we find? We find this. We are mostly interested in the gray part of the bars in the bottom, and this is the ones not using any leave. Then you have the red ones using up to 1 month, the green one using up to 3 months, and then the light blue in the top are the ones using more than 3 months of leave, fathers using more than 3 months of leave. And you can see, for a start, you can see a very big drastic decline in fathers not using any leave from 94 to 95. And this is when we introduced the first reserved month. You see another decline in 2002, which is the second month that was introduced. And then, the third month was introduced in 2016, and I don't think we see such a big decline then. Before the first reserved month, about half of all fathers did not use any leave. And that then has developed to what we have today. In the children born in 2017, out of those, it's 18% that have a father not using any leave at all. And about 15% that have a father who have used maximum 1 month of leave. So this means that about 1/3 of all children born today have a father who's not using any leave the first 2 years. And this is actually quite a lot. And if you look at the bottom bar, the development after 95 has not been very big. So for all the good things that the parental leave reforms have done in Sweden, it hasn't really decreased the number of fathers not using any leave. And now I will show you that by income. Maybe that's the major factor in what matters. We have, of course, looked at a number of other factors too. So we looked at income quintiles, and this is only for the children born in the end of the period. The blue are the ones not using any leave, and the red are the ones, again, they're using very short leave, and the green ones are using more than 1 month. You can see that in the first quintiles, the ones with very low income, it's about 1/5 that are not using any leave. In the top quintile, it's 16%, and then it's a bit less. It's a U-shaped pattern, so it's the two ends that have the larger shares of non-users. But I think this is maybe a good example of you have a finding. There are differences, but it's not very big, is it? We have the whole of Sweden, so certainly it's statistically significant, but surely there's a lot of other things going on here too. And I think maybe even more important than that we have the pattern is that the pattern is not stronger than this. We look at this over time, of course, too. And I show you here 2 figures. I show you the raw descriptive numbers firstly, and then you see very clearly that the ones with low income, the share of those that are not using the leave is much higher. But once we adjust for all the other factors that we can adjust for with the register data, the differences are not very big in the second panel, as you see. And it's not that the effect is taken away by one of these factors, but it's, taken away a little bit. So by all the factors. So I think that one conclusion here is really that there's a lot of heterogeneity and variation going on in which fathers are not using the leave. We look at this for different things. So as one would expect, the ones not using the leaves are self-employed, low educated, the ones with immigrant background, the ones that are not in employment, and the ones that are not registered for custody very fast after the birth, and for the ones with more children. So fathers are using much more for the first child and later children in Sweden, and older fathers are using less. Okay, why is this so interesting? I think this is interesting when we compare it to mothers, because mothers are almost always using the leave. It's like 1 or 2% not using the leave, and I think that's misclassifications in some ways most of the time. And what's happening is that a care gap is created with the reserved months. Because if you're a mother that are the only one using the leave, you can't use the whole leave. So you can maximum use 13 months of leave, and 3 of those months are paid at a very low flat rate, another low flat rate, which means that if the father is not using his leave, the mother will have a hard time to have her parental leave covering the whole period until she's guaranteed a place in childcare. So childcare is guaranteed from age 1 in Sweden, but often you don't get it at a birthday, but you wait until a semester start or so. So what I want to point out here is that this gender equal policy that has led to a lot of good things for the general or the major part is really to the disadvantage to the gender unequal parents. And that's mainly single mothers. It's also mothers and fathers living together, but when a mother is the one doing and this is not then a minor group. It's 1/3 of all children in Sweden. So it's a big group. I think we know this already, but it's important to point out that this is not a minor little problem. It's a major problem, I would say. Secondly, another group, this is a study I did together with Eleonora Musino, and it was a study that the Center for Business and Policy Studies wanted us to do. It's the use of parental leave among immigrant mothers. So the background for this study is that there's a dramatic difference in how immigrants in Sweden, mothers and fathers, but here we look at mothers, are using the parental leave. And the parental leave, and this really reflects that the situation on the labor market is very different from immigrant mothers and Swedish-born mothers in Sweden. And there's a political debate on the eligibility for parental leave and whether this long leave that we have, whether that actually can be a disincentive for women to work. Is this an obstacle? This long leave, does this work as an obstacle for women to be integrated and to work in Sweden? Also, there's unintended generosity in the system that's just recently taken away. It wasn't intended like this, but it means that as you can use the leave whenever you want until the child is 8, it means that if you arrive in Sweden with a child, say, age 4, you get the whole 16 months of leave that normally is used when the child is born. But as you come here, you have the right to it, so you can use it. And say then that you are a mother and a father coming with 2 children, age 4 and 5. Well, then you have 32 months that you can stay at home with paid benefits, it's criticized. The children should be in daycare to learn Swedish, and the parents should be in some kind of labor market integration activity. Well, when this was paid at a very low rate, maybe it didn't matter so much because no one can live on €6 a day in Sweden. But now it's €25 a day. So it's starting to become a possibility to live on that, given that the other parent is working. And you don't have the reserved months. So it's the mothers that are using this leave. It's not the fathers. We try to look at fathers, but there's so few that it's just random. And in addition to that, maybe this is a way to be at home, the municipalities gain very much from this because it's the state who pays the parental leave. And it's the municipalities that would have to pay any other kind of support for these parents, like integration or any kind of support. So the municipalities want this to happen because the costs for them are then less. And there's some evidence that it's used in that way for women coming, but not for men. Today, since 2017, there are some age restrictions. So you don't have, if you come with a 4-year-old, you don't have access to the whole leave anymore. So immigrant mothers, are they really using the leave when they are coming with children? And does this lead to any kind of consequences? And we compare then all the women coming and men, but we look at women specifically that are coming to Sweden. And we have different groups then. We have a large group of Swedish-born women that have been outside and then are coming back. We have European labor market migrants, and we have refugees. When we look at this from 95 to 2040, we end up with a fairly large population of about 80,000 women that are coming with their children under 8 years old to Sweden. Again, we divide parental leave then up into different groups. First, we look at whether they are using it or not. And for the ones that are using the parental leave, we look at the ones that are using it part-time, so not very much every month, and the ones that are using it full-time. And we say that part-time is up to 14 days a month, and then more than that, we consider full-time use. And that's because of the distribution. This was a good way to categorize it. And then regarding labor market attachments or what they are doing afterwards, you can see the list of things we're looking for, but the major interest here is whether you are working with low income, meaning really that you don't have a full-time job, or with high income. But we also, some are student unemployed, some have another child, and some emigrate, of course. So among these immigrants coming to Sweden, about 1/3 are refugees, but also another third of the family migrants are often family migrants to refugees. But about 1/3 don't require any kind of visa. So those are the Swedes returning, but also EU migrants. And some other, you can see, have work permit, reasons to come, and so on. And we control for things that we can control for in the register data. And we find this. So we look at them the first year that they come to Sweden, and then the second year. And we look at the parental leave then for the period that they are in Sweden, the first year they come, and for the second year. The blue line here for the first year is the first panel, and then the first full year is the second panel. The blue is the share of users. And you can see that over time, the share of users has increased quite dramatically. The first year it's up to 40% today. And the first full year, it's about half of all mothers that come with children are using the leave. The red is the average number of days used per month. And you can see that that's not increasing as much. But the gray is that when we take away the non-users, it's the average of the users. It's an increase for the first year, but it's a major increase in the beginning of the 2000s. And that is when this flat rate is increasing. And you see that the major increase is at the same time as this flat rate is increasing. And then looking at this for different groups of parents, here I'm only showing you the share of users for the 10 biggest groups arriving in Sweden. And on the lowest, it's the Swedish return migrants. And you can see that, the blue is the first year and the red is the second year. Well, the second year, the use is much larger. It's large for some groups that are recent immigrants to Sweden, like Syrians and Somalis, for example. The use is quite large. It's very low in the typical labor market migrants, like the Germans and the Danes and the Poles are not using the leave as much. They come here to work to another extent. But also look at the Swedes. It's used by the Swedes as well. So it's used by different groups for different reasons, but it is used. So when this is used, what has it led to? Or does it lead to anything for their labor market migration? So now I will show you the use divided into this three groups, the non-users, the users, part-time users, and the full-time users, and what this has led to for their labor market situation, the first full year in Sweden and the second year in Sweden. And the thing that we should focus on here is the blue and the red bars, because those are the ones that have work, they have income from work. And you can see that for the first year, the inactive are the ones that haven't come into the yellow one, that haven't come into any kind of activity yet. But if we compare the blue and the red bars, we see that the ones that have mostly, or the share of most that have an income, it's actually highest among the part-time users. And this is even clearer in the second panel for the second year, that the ones that have used the leave but haven't used it very much, they are the ones that are in work today more. But again, here, the differences are not really large. It's a difference, and statistically, this is certainly significant, but the differences are not completely large. There are other things that matter for whether people are working or not, women are working or not, the first years in Sweden. So we see that the proportion of users are increasing over time, but the number of days are quite stable. But this doesn't seem to lead to very strong consequences for the labor market. The implications for this is really that when the flat rate was increased, this might matter for the incentives to work. But the major conclusion is that there are differences, but how much that matters for the labor market career, it's not a very strong effect. But the flat rate seems to matter. And the last study that I will talk about, and I'm sorry that I took a little longer, but the last study that I will talk about is this increase in the flat rate. This is another study done together with a colleague, Niklas Korsell, and we looked at when they increased the flat rate so dramatically, they doubled it and then they increased it again. Does this lead to anything for childbirth in Sweden? Does it lead to young women having children more often, the ones without income? And does it lead to continued childbearing? And does it lead to this housewife trap of women staying at home longer? So the major increase happened then in 2002, but there was also a major increase in 2013. This flat rate is used very much more among the immigrant mothers than among other mothers. But it's used by about 3%, 2% of the Swedish born, but for some groups, it's very commonly to use. So we try to see whether we can find an effect of this increase in the flat rate. And we do this by comparing the ones that have used the parental leave on this basic level, then how they react, with the ones that have income-related benefits. And we don't take everyone, but we take the ones with a low income then to compare groups that are somewhat similar. We also look at risk of childbearing, and then we look at women in young ages to see whether this flat rate increased their intensity to have or their risk to have a child. And we don't find it generally, but we do find it among students actually, that this increase in the flat rate increased their childbirth a little bit. The major question of work outcomes here, it's a problem with this policy because it applies to everyone. It doesn't just apply to children born after a different day. So it's a problem of who to compare with who, because everyone could have this new flat rate. So depending on how long we follow the parents, that matters for who we are actually comparing. So if we're only looking at them for 1 year, we can compare the children born in 2000 and 2001. The 2000 then are not affected by this flat rate because most of the leave is used during the first 2 years, while the ones born in 2001 are getting this new flat rate. So we assume that major uses of the parental leave is for the first 2 years. And we look at competing risk models. First, I will show you the first year and then the second year, and competing risk of having another child and going back to work. So if we follow then the control groups who didn't get the increase in the flat rate with the treatment group that had a much better flat rate when they were at home, we see basic levels are the ones using it at the basic level. The income-related group are the ones then that are not really affected because they had an income above this. We find that the first year, among the basic level, it's the ones that were not affected. There was about 3.6% of all mothers had another child within 12 months. We compare that to the treatment group that had better benefits being at home, that was increased to 5.1%. And among the income-related, there's no difference between these two groups. But this is an increase, but it's not statistically significant, so it's a small increase. If we look at work, so we're looking at the risk to be in work 1 year after you had your child. And that was 1/10 of all parents, of all mothers in the control group. And that actually declined to half of that after having a better benefit while being at home. For the income-related group, it's a higher number, but it's not changed over time. And this is significant. So actually the time at home seems to have increased, or the risk to still be at home 1 year after having a child increased with this increase in flat rate. And similarly, when we look at them for 2 years, then we have to go back 1 year with a control group. But we see the same pattern. It's actually the ones that are experiencing this increasing parental leave benefit, they are staying at home for a longer time. So we see this as proof that actually the flat rate matters for, not so much for childbearing in the short run, but it matters for whether you go back to work quickly or not. So how do we discuss this? The incentives to work or to have this, the increase in the flat rate is to have an economic security for all families, and it's very hard to be against that, of course. But once you increase that, we should be aware that the incentive to work is actually decreasing. We need to be aware of that this is happening in the policy. If we have a freedom to choose to be on leave or not, then that will have effects for gender equality. We have 1/3 of fathers not using even the reserved months for them. So it's something given to them. and lost, forfeited if not used. Still, this is the situation, and that has consequences for some groups. Flexibility in use and labor market outcomes. We don't see so much evidence that actually this flexibility leads to a housewife trap at all so far. With the example I took with the newly arrived immigrants, we don't see it. So again, we need to be nuanced in what kind of consequences different policies lead to. My conclusions or my take on this is that we need to study the unintended consequences broadly. We need to think about different kind of consequences, and we need to think about it long term too. This could be found in statistics, the share of non-users and so on. So it has to be a strong will for the agency to show all kinds of different statistics, not just the statistics that show how good Sweden is, but also the other consequences. We do see that parents respond to economic incentives, but there are certainly a lot of other things going on too. We need to study subgroups of parents, not just this major group of behaving as you should parents. And there are different reasons to not use the parental leave. I mean, the self-employed and the immigrants maybe have very different reasons for not using the leave. And the parental leave all the time in Sweden is closely connected to the labor market policy. And sometimes we forget this. Of course, they are related. So we need to study these together all the time. Okay, thank you very much.